afternoon and welcome to the September 29th, 2021 City Council work session. Thank you for joining us in this remote meeting format we're using as our state and community continue to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. This format enables the City Council to meet and take care of business while keeping everyone safe. For work sessions like this one where there is no opportunity for public comment, those wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling into one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcast and meeting materials web page. And with that, thank you again for joining us, and I will turn it over to the manager for our first item.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. Our first topic today is a more focused conversation on the American Rescue Plan Act and the funds that the city received. I'm very grateful for these rescue funds since we're still very much in a pandemic state. We're still meeting virtually, which I can't believe that so many things are still in place. I know we talk about this with some frequency, but really happy that we were able to receive these funds. We've given you some high-level previews in the past, but we've held off on a more focused conversation on the specific funds until we really understood our financial condition better. So we've been trying to build these conversations on each other. We just very recently gave you a financial condition report and kind of an update of where we're at with all of our different funds at a pretty high level. But these conversations definitely build on each other. You know, it's the conversations around COVID and our COVID response, the conversation around the budget, your council goals, your council and community concerns. So there's a lot of things built into this and they kind of overlap and intersect, but we're going to try to just really kind of hone in on this today so you can understand some of the framework we're thinking about and we can understand what your hopes are and what guidance you might want to give us as we prepare for the fall budget committee meetings that are going to be more focused again on this topic. So with that, I'm joined by Renee and Mia, and I think Renee is kicking it off.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, Mayor and Council. It's good to see you this afternoon. I've seen some of you lately, but not all of you, so it's really good to reconnect, even if it is virtually. I'm Renee Gruby, for those of you at home, the Library, Recreation, Cultural Services Director, and I'll be joined with Mia Carriaga, our Central Services Director. Mia and I are leading our internal policy team around ARPA funds, along with Denny Bro of Planning Development. And Ethan Nelson is on the call too to help with any technical questions. So as we progress through here, you got a wealth of information and talent to answer any of your questions. So for today, Mia, if you could, yep, there we go. For today, what we're going to do is kind of share with you our framework, what we've been thinking about as we move forward with these funds, give a little more in-depth overview of what the ARPA is and how it's being rolled out into communities. We'll talk to you a little bit about eligible uses and then kind of where we are today. So to start with framework. Yeah.
Well, the slide doesn't want to advance. I'm sorry.
So that's why we have a winding path in your first slide.
Yeah, apologies. Let me try again.
So Mia, sometimes if you screen share and then open your PowerPoint.
There we go.
Okay, there you go.
Thank you.
All right. As we began preparing for these funds, we adopted a framework provided by the Brookings Institute of Stabilize, Strategize, and Implement. This framework provides a straightforward approach by which we can assess the various opportunities that continue to arise within ARPA. Many local governments are using this framework across the country, not just in Oregon, but across the country. And we'll get into this in more detail when Mia does her section, but I wanted to give you just a high level framing of how we're thinking about these funds. So what is the American Rescue Plan Act? And all of you know it's $1.9 trillion dollars that Congress passed and President Biden adopted in 2021. And as Sarah said, it is a rescue plan for communities to get us through these times. And so that's a lot of money. How is that being spent? And how is that being allocated out into communities? And I love this slide because one, it's full of color. And there's a lot of words, but at least it's in a pie chart. And as you can see, the American Rescue Plan of 1.9 million is spread across society and the economy. And it's focused on a lot of different areas that will help drive our economic recovery. But for today's purposes, we're going to focus on this light green section, which is a state and local aid. And it'll be, there you go. So this piece of the pie, that's 350 billion of this total $1.9 trillion. And to see that in another view, how it's set up across sectors, we're focusing today on the state and local funding. As I said earlier, the takeaway is that the funding for states, counties, cities, and tribes is really intended to be a fiscal rescue plan and to keep public agencies fully staffed and maintain critical services throughout the pandemic and into the recovery, which is where we're headed. With that recognition that many governments saw reduced revenues and impact of the pandemic. And so that's where we're focusing. And I would like to say, as you can see here, it's cities and counties in red. We're super grateful for the county partnership as we move forward on this. They've been good collaborators, and it'll be essential that we continue that as we move forward managing the funds that we have and opportunities for leveraging other funds in the various different places that ARPA presents itself. So what is the state and local recovery funds, and how does that look? You'll see 4.26 billion is actually coming to Oregon. 2.6 billion of that is going directly to the state. 155 million of that is for capital projects. Counties across the state have the next biggest share of 818 million, and cities not quite 681 million. And we're in that piece of the pie. How is this different from the CARES Act funding that we were receiving during the first year of the pandemic? The difference is this is not a reimbursement program. ARPA, the funds are coming to larger cities like Eugene directly from federal treasury, and the state cannot restrict the use of these funds. Local and regional funding. So this is the piece that we've been talking about for the city. The city received almost 36 million, or will receive almost 36 million. The first half was received in May, a little over 17 million. And that, as you know, the second half will be coming in June of 2022. The first half was placed in a separate revenue reserve in the general fund until we could have these conversations with council as part of the supplemental budget process. This is really what we're talking about here today. And to tie into that, the county received a little over 74 million, and they'll be doing a similar process with their funds. So what are the kinds of ARP funding? The local fiscal recovery, which is city, county, which we're talking about today, but there's also a myriad of other federal and state funding opportunities in ARP. And I think this is really important as we look forward. We're talking about the local piece of it, but there are so many opportunities for leveraging and just accessing additional funds to accomplish many of the community goals that we have. So I'm going to walk you through a few of these. And these were included in your, samples of these were included in your AIS as an attachment as well, if you want further details. The federal direct is service-based for specific services the city provides that are not always the role of the city. So the airport, HUD, we had shuttered venues, operating grants that would fall into this category. Local fiscal recovery, these are state of Oregon legislative member allocations. And again, those were listed in your AIS, and also Ethan provided that to you at the end of the legislative session in June. But these, as you heard, these were specifically designated for Eugene projects that we requested. Local fiscal recovery, state of Oregon, these are program allocations. The 2021 legislature allocated money to existing programs. These are existing programs from ARPA dollars that'll be distributed statewide. Local fiscal recovery, state of Oregon competitive grants. In addition to the funding that existing programs, the state is also putting money into competitive grants in addition to that. Federal competitive agency programs. This is an area that we're needing to do more research, and we continue to do research. But there are a large number, there's a significant amount of funding being released through competitive grants like FEMA's BRIC program and a number of EDA, Economic Development Agency grants. And while all of these are defined, there's likely to be more. We know it's ever evolving, the ARPA funds at the federal level in particular. There is a possibility that some of the funds could be pulled back to support the current Infrastructure Act. So it's an evolving conversation. But this gives you an idea of the, I would just say the complexity of the ARPA program and the amount of opportunities there are for us to be creative and leverage things that we're trying to accomplish in this community. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mia.
Okay, so ARPA requirements provide for a wide variety of uses, and all of those categories are listed here. But for purposes of today and use of the first installment we received in the spring, we're going to focus on those that relate to recent council conversations and some of our immediate needs as we know them to be. And another key takeaway here is that these funds are far more flexible than the CARES funding we previously received. So the first allowable use I want to highlight is use of funds for revenue loss. Because like us, cities across the country are seeing significant downturns to revenues, these funds can be used to mitigate future financial issues and to pay for general services that would have been funded if not for pandemic impacts. To identify the amount we're allowed to use for this purpose, we look at our pre-pandemic projections for revenue collection and compare that with revenues we've actually received. We're currently wrapping up our FY21 financial audit, which will allow us to zero in on those numbers. Another eligible use to highlight is related to disproportionately impacted communities. Here we're highlighting some of the provisions related to housing and services for unhoused individuals. These are really specific. But as you all know, we have increased our services through the pandemic and are doing some new and different things we may not have done otherwise. As we've shared along the way, many of these services we've been providing don't have an identified funding source. So ARPA dollars could be used to pay for these services. In addition to releasing specifics about how ARPA dollars can be used, the US Treasury made clear some ineligible uses. And the most important to note here is that funds cannot be used to replenish reserves. If that was an option, given the amount of reserves we used in various funds to maintain operations and support the community through the pandemic, we could easily use the entire first installment of 17 million to do that. So in addition to allowable uses of the funds, the Treasury issued pages and pages of rules and requirements, as you can imagine, and some additional details were included in the AIS about a lot of those, not all of them. There are so many. We also have skilled folks that are tracking these really closely. There have been rule revisions since the first were released, and we're tracking all of that. A highlight here is that we have until the end of calendar year 2024 to obligate the funds for specific uses. And then we have through the end of calendar year 2026 to actually spend the dollars. This means that while we're working on a path that leads to the supplemental budget for this first installment, we have time to continue to plan and be strategic for any unused funds or the second installment that we hope to receive in the spring of 2022. So as Renee mentioned, when we learned we'd be receiving the ARPA dollars earlier this year, we began to explore frameworks that would help us prepare to receive the funds and organize our work so we could best support organizational needs and council conversations. We also know we want to leverage internal resources and seek other opportunities for funds and grants as they become available. By stabilize, we mean shoring up the city's shortfalls to the extent we can. Early on in the pandemic, we prioritized keeping employees whole and services running, and we had to use reserves to do that. Strategize refers to a longer-term look at recovery. Staff across all departments are keeping tabs on competitive funding opportunities. We're looking at opportunities to fund infrastructure and looking for investments that will help bolster or grow future revenues. The gist of it is that we'll use every opportunity to create long-term benefits to the community. Finally, implements. We have an internal policy team, as Renee mentioned. We also have an operations team, and we're hiring a limited duration ARPA manager to help with this effort over the next 2 years. As a connection to Strategize, this position will help departments seek and apply for state and federal funding opportunities. So we leverage what we already have for maximum community benefit. We also anticipate this position will coordinate cross-jurisdictional efforts and help meet our compliance requirements for these funds. As mentioned, there are lots. Based on the rules from the Treasury, Council conversations, the fact that we are still amidst a pandemic, and what we know about our current financial condition, these are the things we're currently considering to be included in the city manager's proposal for the first ARPA installment. The Budget Committee passed 2 related motions in the spring. One was to prioritize ARPA dollars for restoration of fire services at Station 2, and that was roughly $1 million. The second was to prioritize $50,000 using ARPA funds for the urban forestry program. So those 2 motions will be included in the city manager's proposal in October. Next, we're looking at fund stabilization. While the audit isn't finalized yet, we know we're legally required to balance all funds. Also, ARPA doesn't allow for reserve replacement, as I mentioned, but there are a number of other things we didn't do in order to keep the lights on and keep employees whole through the pandemic. These are costs we'll eventually incur, so we could use some funds for key work we held in abeyance to reduce future financial liability. An example is in the parking fund, where we saw immediate and sharp declines in revenues, so used reserves for day-to-day operations. Those reserves would have been used for projects to help maintain or expand revenue levels, such as modernizing the 3 elevators at the Overpark. So shelter, you're all well aware of our efforts to shelter and house folks. Again, a significant portion of this work is unfunded, and there are a number of ways ARPA dollars could be used to continue these efforts, both with costs we've incurred since March, since the Treasury requirements would allow us to do that, and into the future. And finally, COVID response, we are still in the pandemic. We still have increased health and safety costs across the organization, and we will need some flexibility for unknowns that will inevitably come over the coming months. So these are the next steps. Today, we're here to listen. Based on everything we just covered and any comments you have today, the city manager will put together a proposal to share with the budget committee at those meetings in October. And that discussion will be used to build a supplemental budget that will go back to the committee for review prior to a council public hearing and potential action on December 13th. And that's the last of the slides.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the complexity of this, and I think seeing it laid out makes it really clear how many pieces there are to navigate, and would just say off the top, appreciate the thoughtfulness around actually hiring a manager who can help make sure we take advantage of these opportunities, because it is a lot to learn, and it's like creating a whole new department almost just to oversee this endeavor. So I appreciate the thoughtfulness of that, and open it for counselors. It looks like, all right, Matt, take it away.
Great, thanks, Mayor, and thanks to the team that put this together. I really appreciate seeing the pie chart in particular. If we have the ability to go back to the pie chart, I noticed that there was a bucket for disbursement to restaurants and bars, but I don't recall seeing a bucket for small businesses in particular. Maybe that falls under the oh, there it is, farmers, small businesses, and other vital industries. Okay, that's helpful, because my thought goes to local movie theaters, local retail, and especially considering the state can't constrain fund disbursement. I wonder if there's an opportunity in the future for the second installment and beyond, if there's a public-facing portal that asks for public engagement or input around fund disbursement dollars. That's my first question. The second question would be, how much of the $17 million is currently obligated? What is the amount of the second installment in 2022? And back to that first inquiry, I suspect that the proposed ARP manager would have a great deal to say about some future public-facing portal. But I wonder if other municipalities have done that, or if that's been part of the conversation to solicit conceptual ideas from residents of our community. Thanks.
I can maybe speak to the first question. You can answer the second. Councilor King, that's a good question. We do anticipate that the ARPA manager will have a role in our community outreach and engagement, and how that looks, or whether it's a portal or some other way. We know that in particular, maybe for the second payment, or the second 17 million, that will be an area that we'll need to do more work on. And I don't know if other communities are doing portals in that way, but that's something we can certainly explore.
That's helpful. Thank you. So if theoretically, if someone had a conceptual idea about fund disbursement to local businesses that hired local graduates, that'd be a win-win. There would be a very clear pathway for someone to advance said concept and hopefully have a dialogue around that and see that come to fruition. What's a projected timeline for said ARPA manager or potential portal?
We've already, we're moving forward with, we've created the job posting. And so we anticipate having probably, how these things go as far as recruitment and onboarding, but hopefully this fall we'll have someone in place depending on how our recruitment goes. And then again, we'll have to, talk about what those strategies are for the community engagement once that person's on board.
Okay, Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate it. Great presentation, Renee and Sarah. Could you put up that next to last slide that had the 4, suggestion areas again? Considerations, I think you called them there. I know. It was like the second to last slide, I think. There you go. Okay, so you may have said it and I didn't hear it, but what was the total number of budget committee motions that have already been made for consideration?
So the restoration of services at Fire Station 2 was $1 million, and the urban forestry motion was $50,000.
Okay. What do you imagine the fund stability share being and the COVID response being?
So the COVID response would be dollars that we, if council's
Sure.
comfortable with it, we would suggest setting aside for future unanticipated costs related to our pandemic response.
You have a number there?
That would be scalable. No.
Okay.
We were going to come up with an estimate based on today's conversation about some of the other categories and such. And then fund stability, as I said, the audit is wrapping up. I will say that the parking fund, stormwater, wastewater, cultural services subfund, and road fund all incurred major issues and had to dip into reserves. And so if we consider that those are just some of the funds, 5 that experienced some pretty significant issues, I think that we could probably, as I said, use the entire 17 million, but we'll be balancing that along with council's other priorities.
Aren't we dancing a little bit close to the line there with regard to reserves and other replacement costs that are precluded?
Well, the ARPA requirements clearly allow for general service provisions, meaning we can pay for anything that we would normally pay for out of operations. So while we have budget authority for regular operations in the parking fund, for example, if we're to use those funds for infrastructure, as an example, if we were to use ARPA funds for infrastructure, that would increase our balance available at the end of the year and our ability to contribute funds to reserves.
Okay. Lastly, I would say I don't have anywhere near all of the information that staff has with regard to the guidelines, and I'm sure there are plenty of what we can and can't do. But of the 35 million total in the 2 different payments, it occurs to me that the community's most crying need, and the thing we frequently make excuses for why we can't do something, revolves around shelter. And it would occur to me, if it were my opportunity to spend 20 million, 25 million to leverage it on affordable housing, much as we've done with the money from the CE and in other ways, to leverage it with private partners and build more affordable housing in our community. There are any number of places we could spend this, but to me, that's the most crying need. And could you comment, Sarah, on thoughts around leveraging those dollars to bring in even larger amounts of dollars to address that issue?
Yeah, I think that's part of the purpose of having an identified staff person that's also just looking for those funds, because I think we can leverage the dollars we have now, and there's other funds out there that aren't specifically in that city county piece of pie that we can also seek for these opportunities. I think it's important to just, in terms of the framework, we're basically saying, hey, here's where we're thinking these funds need to be kind of sliced up. We need to honor the commitments around the budget committee. We do need to provide for fund stability, and then looking at kind of that housing and shelter and some of the work we're already doing that's not funded that you're going to hear about even in the next work session. Like these are, and COVID response, these are general areas, and then we'll come back with a more formal proposal about here's what the number is as part of the budget process.
And I want to be clear too, I'm not talking about temporary shelter for the currently unhoused. I'm talking about building permanent housing that, we have a couple of partners that have been very successful in the last couple of years to help leverage dollars better. That's the whole, I want to revisit the whole conversation around the CE. But why we're not dropping 20 million in there and saying, hey, let's have a housing boom on affordable housing take place right now, because it'll put local people to work. It'll, that money will stay in the community, and we solve a whole host of problems at one time. So when you're preparing your proposal, you've now heard from me with regard to the dollars, the proportion, and what I think is the crying need. So thanks.
Thank you, Alan, and then Randy.
Yeah, I had a similar question to Mike's. Maybe I'll just phrase it differently. So I know there's no such thing as money without strings, especially from the feds. So and so they all have to be in certain buckets. But maybe Sarah or Renee or Mia, you can talk about how much of the current dollars and then prospectively think that we might seek would actually end up being discretionary for things that we haven't already earmarked. I have a sense that that's going to be very limited, and I don't want the council and the community to go off thinking there's this gigantic pot of money and we got all these pet projects that we can fund, because I don't think that's the case. So maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, I think the way that I think about that, you're absolutely right, that it will, very few of the funds, if any, will allow for a lot of discretion. However, we do have a myriad of unfunded needs and things that we want to accomplish, some that will be required to accomplish in future years and still need funding for. And so we have very specific, well-articulated programs and projects that we could seek funding for as opportunities that tie to those services become available.
Mm-hmm. Renee or Sarah, what about my statement that there's going to be very little of this that's actually available for projects, pet projects that people have or ideas?
Yeah, I think most of that kind of ties into, what we hope is that there is, that over the 2 payment periods, that there's some opportunity to achieve some things that you really want to achieve that might seem discretionary. But I think what Mia is saying is you've already sort of outlined what they are. I think the reality is in the first payment, based on where we are with COVID right now and where we are financially, there's not going to be a lot of funds to move around with discretion. I think it's going to be that conversation could be different next year.
Mm-hmm. The next question I had related to not our funds, but the funds directly related to rental assistance, and which is quite a big chunk. I think it's all going to Lane County, as I understand. I'm wondering if you could review how much that is, how it's being done, what the city's role is, and what's the current status of that disbursement, because nationally it's pretty, the $40 billion only been a couple of billion done, and that's huge for renters that need to pay back rent, and if this isn't done in a timely fashion, that's going to put a lot of people out on the street.
I think I'll let Denny or Ethan talk about the specifics on that. Denny, do you have that?
Yeah, thank you, Councilor Zelenka. In addition to the first round of CARES funding that the county received, and then we provided through our CARES allocation some additional funding to the county for rental assistance. And I can't remember exactly what those dollars were, but several $1 million. The county has received something in the neighborhood of, I think, $16 million for rental assistance. And all of the conversations we have had with them is they have enough resource there to address the demand and the need, and they're keeping up with the demand at this point, and more funds really wouldn't help them at this point is what we've heard from them thus far. So they have a pretty nice fund that they're utilizing for rental assistance right now.
Do we know how much of that 16.8 million has been dispersed?
I don't, but we can get back with you on that.
Yeah, that'd be good. Because and for people who are watching or hearing about this, that there's still funds available in that, I understand. So if you're in that circumstance, please reach out and take advantage of that to pay your landlords. And so landlords get whole, which is a lot of times small businesses, and renters can stay in their rentals. Thanks.
Thank you, Randy, and then Claire.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, Renee and Mia, for the presentation and all the staff that put a lot of work into this. I want to echo what some of the other counselors have said. I really appreciated the pie chart that just gave a really good visual for where we are. I like what I'm hearing. I'm glad that staff mentioned restoring engine 2 or maintaining engine 2. I appreciated what Councillor Clark said about the housing. I agree that's something that this is money that we're not always going to have access to. I appreciate what Councillor Keating said about supporting small businesses and want to echo that. And I believe in what Councillor Zelenka said as well about supporting renters. We do not need to add to our unhoused challenges on the street that we're experiencing. With that said, I still like the idea of looking at how we can best utilize one-time money for one-time projects to help us get a handle on our unhoused situation. But I also want to come at housing from the other side and go back to jobs that I frequently bring up. I would hope that we could use, some of this and set it aside to help develop some shovel-ready projects. I know that when businesses do come to look at us, and I know there's an event in mid-October where some are coming to take a look, it's important that they see clean streets, accessible streets, infrastructure, and places where if they are so inclined, they could easily and quickly establish their infrastructure. So that's something I would appreciate if we could at least take a look at and maybe get a little information back on what that would take and what would our role be. I'm sure it's around systems development and developing the street grid if it's not into some of these properties. Possibly if you can get back on that, maybe even some information on what type of funding would be available in the various buckets. Again, I realize this is one-time money, but it's also an opportunity for some transformational work that could set us up for many years into the future. And I'm hoping that we're taking the long look at this and where do we want to be and how do we position ourselves in the right lane to get there? How do we better work with our partners in the community to get there? So I don't have a lot of questions beyond that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Claire.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Mia and Renee, for the presentation. I did have one question and then some comments. Mia, you said we couldn't, that our reserves are down because we used them to cover expenses during the COVID crisis. But the CARES Act funding was meant to reimburse us for expenses related to responding to COVID. So are those two different things then?
So what I meant was that revenue collection was down, so we weren't receiving new revenue at a time when then we were required to use reserves for regular operations. So as an example, we weren't collecting parking revenue. However, we still had a fully staffed team that were performing a whole lot of work and still had to pay them. And to do that, we had to use reserves because we weren't collecting new revenue through the pandemic.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. Mm-hmm. And, I hear Councilor Zelenka in particular trying to say we're not going to have a lot of discretion, but I actually heard we have quite a lot of discretion in how we can spend this as long as it's spent on legitimate city expenditures to provide services or address infrastructure needs. So we can't pay off debt, we can't put it into PERS, but otherwise it seems like there's a breadth of things that we could spend it on. And I definitely think what Mia articulated around, we have a list of unfunded needs and things we know we're going to have to spend money on in the future, and that, you're looking at those things. I think that's the right emphasis. And I also recognize, as Randy pointed out, these are one-time dollars. So, but here are some ideas in addition to what, I appreciate Councilor Clark calling out affordable housing. I think that's a definite place for us to think about some chunk of that money and then leveraging that. But you know, in spite of all the chaos at the Capitol right now, I believe we are going to see an infrastructure bill come out, and I would like us to see us leverage funds for expansion of our high-speed fiber beyond downtown. Thinking about last mile gaps in sidewalks that are difficult to find funding for, maybe in places where we don't have any co-located street projects coming soon, and locations that are crying out for a sidewalk to the bus stop, for example. I'm thinking about enhancing library services that weren't funded by the fact that this council chose to go out for the smaller of the two library levies, and maybe there are some particular projects in that second larger package that didn't get funded that might benefit here. Some, and a little closer to my ward, some restoration for the Washington Jefferson Park, and some funding for the neighborhood, for some neighborhood-based projects as a mean of giving back to the neighborhood for shouldering the burden of our managed camps for the last 18 months. So those are some thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you. Alan, the second round?
Yeah, just to clarify, when I said discretionary, I meant purely discretionary. Each one of these funds is going to come to us within a bucket, and we have to spend it within that bucket. You can't take that money and use it somewhere else. And you can't combine buckets usually. So like we on road bonds, we have to spend it on roads. URD, we have to spend it in the URD, or SDCs, you have to spend it on SDC activities only. We can't just take that money and move it over. And so the discretion that we have is within the bucket. So yes, we can do that, but we have to be mindful of the strings that are attached to all that money. It's not just purely we can spend it on anything or any amount, and we can just move it around. It's going to be, I think, going to be constrained. That's my experience with federal dollars anyway.
Okay, thank you. Any other counselors needing a moment? I just wanted to echo what some of my colleagues said, and I think I'm all on board with the idea that the extent to which we can look at the, you know, we're going to hear about the housing implementation pipeline. So as we look at both shelter and moving up the pipeline to affordable housing, is definitely a place of interest. And I do appreciate actually Alan's questions around what the county has, because I think it'll be helpful to us going forward to keep in mind where county resources are being applied and what we uniquely need, as opposed to something that might be more robustly funded at the county level, so that we keep a kind of a clear perspective on that, particularly as it relates to shelter and housing and stabilization. So those are my thoughts. And I think with that, I really appreciate the work that you've done here and the clarity with which you've presented something that's got an awful lot of pieces to it. So thank you. Thank you very much. And we look forward to the next conversation about this. And with that, I think we are ready, Manager, to move on to the second agenda item.
Yeah, the second agenda item is a good segue. And I think Christy and Matt are kicking this off. So I'll just let them get started.
Thank you, Sarah. Christy Hammett, Assistant City Manager, joined again with to give you a presentation with Matt Rodriguez, our Public Works Director. We're here to represent the work of our unhoused response team, who is doing some incredible work that we'll share and making some progress. The team is really focused on the direction that Council provided to establish 300 safe tent sites and 200 safe parking sites. The program model that we're using is really grounded in the work that's happened around the rest stops. Council has mentioned several times that that has been such a great place for people to move on to a better pathway for stabilization. And so that's the focus that we're taking. The work is urgent and important. The crisis is right in front of our community every single day. Our unhoused are experiencing tough situations, and so are our businesses, community members, and the patience that people afford as we work through this is deeply appreciated. This is a community effort. We know that this is not anything that we can do on our own, and are just really grateful for the support. And recently, Matt and I have had a lot of conversations with members of our business community in particular, especially those on the west side of Eugene. And they're doing incredible, taking a lot of initiative to help provide support for at an individual level for those that are unhoused, and also really coming forward with some big ideas around how we think about the long term and where we're headed, and the property opportunities that avail themselves to do that work. It's been really great, and we very much appreciate it. Also want to give a thanks to our providers who are making it possible for us to be here today with the options that we have to share with you. It doesn't look like our slide deck is called up. Kelly, I don't know if you've had a chance to do that or not. And we're on the second slide, Kelly. So on the second slide, we're is really just an overview of our agenda. So we're going to give you a quick update on some of the current situations that we have. And that's, kind of a familiar topic. And we'll also be seeking some action from you today with respect to the establishment of 3 new locations for safe tent and safe parking sites. And I'll give Kelly a minute, see if we can get the slide deck pulled up. Slide number 3, please, Kelly. Perfect. Again, this is very familiar, and the mayor just mentioned that the homeless implementation pipeline team is coming back in October, which is going to be a really great conversation. And just to remind you that the city provides services really in that first category. I mean, we provide services across the continuum, but the focus of the work from the unhoused response team is really centered in that homeless and unsheltered portion. That's really critical, because what we want to do is to provide safe places for people to be, to stabilize them so that they can move through the series of opportunities that avail themselves through the pipeline. Next slide, please. So our current conditions, the homeless by name list is roughly staying pretty consistent at about 2,400. And the urban camping criteria remain in effect, and we're following the public health guidance related to COVID response. We've been adding some staff and infrastructure to mitigate issues as they come up, and trying to be as responsive as we possibly can be to all of the requests for services and questions that we have received. Next slide. So this slide is familiar. It hasn't changed since we were with you on September 8th, and that's because the month hasn't closed out for September, and we didn't want to put, without having a full month of data, we didn't want to put new numbers on there. The one thing I want to point out is that, so Matt and I have been receiving updates on kind of the progress in September, and it's roughly consistent with what we've seen here recently. And one of the things that it's really easy to do when you look at this chart is to think of it as data points and just calls. But really what each one of these numbers represent are people or individuals who are being impacted by the unhoused crisis that we find ourselves in. And the team is doing their best to keep up with the volume of need in response, but just kind of wanted to flag that. I think it's important sometimes that when we look at data, it's just easy to forget that these are all people and the needs of and the impacts of what's going on. Next slide, please. So Matt, I believe this is yours.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. I'm Matt Rodriguez, the Public Works Director. We continue to have concentrated monitoring at Washington Jefferson and 13th Avenue. The latest count at Washington Jefferson is around 227 tents in the park. That's down 16 from when we last presented. Staff completed the gridding work as we discussed at the last presentation, which is organizing the 12 by 12 foot spaces with 12 feet in between each space. And that went really well. It allows for healthier separation and better cleaning, maintenance, and emergency responder access. And generally, we received largely positive feedback from campers in the new arrangement. We continue to have Lane County sheriffs work crews conduct trash removal and cleaning 5 days a week. We have security personnel and monitoring on site and are supported by Eugene Police Patrols and regular visits from the EPD park team. Next slide. At 13th, the count has been holding at 68, down from the peak of 75. As with Washington Jefferson, site monitors have extended coverage across the week. We have staff on site at present at least 16 hours a day, longer on the weekends, and have been covering peak activity times. Site monitors take a lead role in observing any medical or safety issues and reporting emergency services. Following council direction in April, we've continued to implement the commercial industrial parking projects on streets, predominantly in West Eugene. Our last update, 19 streets have had new parking restriction signage installed. Staff continue to enforce parking restrictions. However, they're limited by current staffing capacity. The parking services team is in the process of bringing another 4 staff members on board to help address the backlog and request for service. And we acknowledge that vehicle camping is still a major issue for businesses and residents, as well as for the people that are living that way. To provide a place for vehicle campers to stage until safe sleep sites spaces are available, our Public Works team has used temporary barriers to make a safe space along a portion of 5th Avenue near Bailey Hill. And this is intended to be a staging area for vetted vehicle campers waiting to move into safe sleep sites. This street section will be fenced and monitored to limit vehicle camping access only to those who have been screened and committed to good neighbor agreements. Next, we'd like to give an update on safe sleep sites, including the status of opening 2nd and Garfield and 3 new potential safe sleep sites for your consideration. Our staff continue to work in all phases of the safe sleep site process simultaneously, researching potential locations, assessing sites, doing outreach, and working with social service providers to understand their capacity. Given the challenges of securing service provider support, contractor availability, and delays to materials delivery, it can be complicated to get sites open even once they're approved. And we're trying to keep many options available and certainly looking hard at situations that can come together quickly to provide more capacity. So 2nd and Garfield, we've experienced a number of the challenges I just mentioned at that site, but despite the challenges with the delivery and availability of supplies, structures, and materials, we're very close to opening the site. We're expecting that we can have it open as early as October 4th. It's kind of, weather dependent. We have a couple last pieces to do, a couple concrete pours and some striping that will allow us to open this up, but we're really excited about these being open and having folks being able to move in there. It's a 5-acre property that will accommodate up to 55 vehicles that people are currently using for shelter, as well as additional vehicles used for transportation. St. Vincent de Paul will serve as the operator of the site. As mentioned before, their operational cost per year is about $585,000. Once again, we want to thank the LTD board and staff for working with us to execute this lease and providing the use of the site at no cost for the first 2 years of the lease. Given the size of the site and its largely undeveloped condition, it is a very large investment that we're making in getting this ready as a safe sleep site. Electrical, plumbing, fencing, structures, it's significant, and it is expected to be over $500,000 in total investment. This is not the level of investment we expect to make in every safe sleep site. This one is a little bit unique, and one with our relationship with LTD that we feel will be available depending on the length of time that council determines we want to have it open. Chase Commons Park is the other approved site located between Commons Drive and South Garden Way. It's planned to host up to 20 Conestoga huts. The site is currently in a holding pattern. We're working hard to identify a service provider for the site and further engaging with the neighborhood and businesses to respond to questions and concerns that they have related to this site. So now we're going to move to proposed safe sleep sites. As I mentioned, there are 3. This is the first one at 2243 Roosevelt Boulevard. It's owned by Square One Villages. It's known as the Rosa Safe Sleep Site, if it's approved, of course. They currently operate a microsite on the property that consists of 6 pallet shelters in partnership with the city and Lane County. This site has the ability to move up to an initial 30 spaces with the eventual capacity of up to 40. It will require financial support from the city to operate, and we're currently working with Square One Villages to develop a contract that outlines that. Square One Villages has long-term plans to develop this 3.3 acre site for permanent housing, and community engagement around the site has been somewhat limited so far. Square One and city staff will need to do more as planning unfolds. There's been engagement around the Square One site in the past, but really around the long-term housing plans for the site rather than the short-term plans as a safe sleep site. The next site is known as Everyone Village. It's on Danny Street. It's 3.5 acres. It's located just east of Wallace at the north end of Danny. And it's, if you kind of look at the northern end of the picture, it's very close to the Wallace Street MX stop on West 11. The site could host up to 30 spaces initially and could be a mix of vehicles and small shelters. It would be operated by Everyone Village, which is associated with Pastor Gabe Pihavich's Everyone Church. And I'm sure I said Pastor Gabe's last name wrong. I've been practicing it, but I don't think I nailed it there. The site will require financial support from the city to operate, and you're working with Everyone Village team to scope a contract similar to the Square One Village's site. This site has a longer-term vision as a workforce development and housing project that would be constructed in phases and supported by a coalition of local service providers and businesses. Our Unified Command Business Liaison, Ed Russo, conducted extensive community engagement with neighbors in mid-September, along with Pastor Gabe, and the response was very positive. The last site, and this is a new one since the AIS came out, is at 410 Garfield Street. It's 2.88 acres. It's privately owned. It would be leased by the city. The property is directly adjacent to the second Garfield approved safe sleep site, so it's just to the south of it. It features a 27,000 square foot building that could accommodate up to 90 tent spaces, as well as some area outside the building that might be suitable for pallet shelters, Conestoga huts, or some vehicle camping as well. We've been working with St. Vincent de Paul to vet the site. They would be the operator for this site, as well as Second and Garfield, and are excited about the potential for its use and efficiency of having those two sites co-located. Staff recommend approval of this site as a safe tent and parking site with authorized co-location of multiple groups of tents at this site. Engagement has begun with local businesses about the potential use of this as a safe sleep site, and we will continue to reach out to them if this is approved by council. Christy?
Sorry. Good. Thanks, Matt. So next steps. So one of the most exciting next steps that we're really looking forward to is the opening of the Garfield site. That should be open on Monday, October 1st. The staff have been working really closely with a lot of contractors who have been helping us get that site ready. And I'll also add that the other exciting work that's been happening is just the outreach to the folks that are in vehicles and RVs, especially in the West Eugene area, which was a priority area for council, and helping find those folks places to park safely. The list is full. From what I heard again this morning, the list of people that are willing to move to this site is full. And so we're really looking forward to getting that moving forward. Great work by St. Vincent de Paul, Pastor Gabe, and all of the other folks that are involved. We also want to continue community engagement for the Chase Commons Park. Safe sleep site provider has not been identified yet. And so want to keep those conversations open with that portion of our community. And we'll be doing that as we move forward. We want to pursue development and opening of any proposed sites that council approves as quickly as we possibly can, and then come back with additional sites for approval as we have them available. One of the things I want to say is that a lot of what Matt talked about today is really what we see as phase one implementation for the work that we're doing. And as we talk about with some of these sites, that eventually they can morph into property that can be used for permanent supportive housing, affordable housing projects, or just really kind of advancing the support in the way that we provide the support on these sites for unhoused individuals. And so just kind of keep that in mind, because I know these properties are large and we want to accomplish as much as we can on each of them. Next slide, please. So as Matt mentioned, we're really seeking action today. And so these are the motions that we have before you to approve safe tent and safe parking sites as appropriate for each of these. One of the things that you heard around the 410 Garfield site is that we plan to make that space available to quite a few people. And the ordinance allows for co-location of multiple groups at a site. One of the things that we want to make sure that we do is mitigate the concerns around the surrounding neighborhoods. So Ed's been doing some outreach, and we want to make sure that we're responsive to the concerns, that people have connections with how the site will be run, that we have points of contact and good neighbor agreements to make sure that we're doing all the things that we need to do to make it safe for everybody. Next slide, please. With that, Mayor, we'll turn it back over to you and the council for questions.
Great, thank you very much for that update. And I just want to say, recognizing what a heavy lift this is, it is pretty significant to be coming back with 3 additional sites at this point and moving forward on the first 2. So really appreciate what that has required, both in terms of the staff and the community to really find the resources to do that work. So thank you very much. I have Mike and then Claire first.
Thank you, Mayor. First of all, thank you for the presentation to both of you. This is an enormous amount of work to set this stuff up, but to manage the unified command stuff in the first place is an enormous amount of work, and I think you both working very hard and very well, as well as all the folks working with you. Would you remind me how many spaces are available in the 2nd and Garfield location?
It's 55.
Awesome. And you mentioned that was full. The folks moving in there are screened already and ready to go.
St. Vincent de Paul has done outreach and has talked to 55 vehicle campers about coming into the site that have said they would want to come into the site.
And that was my final question, was going to be how many of the people at Washington Jefferson Park or at 13th and Chambers are moving into that site? And it sounds like the answer is none.
You're correct. Councilor Clark, it's a vehicle site. So the 410 site, the Everyone Village site, and the Squirrel Villages site would all have some capacity for tents that could help to draw people from Washington Jefferson and 13th Avenue.
I know that those are still in beginning and planning phases, and you're seeking initial approval here today. Has any work begun to screen folks for those?
Actually, yes. My understanding is Pastor Gabe has done some work talking to folks in WJ and 13th. I'm not sure about Squirrel and Villages, but St. Vincent de Paul, I think as well, may have had some contact with folks in those locations.
Well, and that's what I'm getting to, that it seems there's an assumption here in this policy, and it's my problem with it. It's the reason I'll probably vote no on the motion, that somehow building these sites will alleviate the camping problems that we have at Washington Jefferson and 13th and Chambers. I don't see that we have policy in place. That it seems like our assumption here is if we build it, they'll go. And I don't see anything in our policy that leads me to believe that will be the case, because there's no portion of this that compels people to stop camping illegally at some certain point, other than the manager having said once that we will go back to regular enforcement of the camping ordinance at some point in the future. Did I get that right, Sarah? So I'm in favor of us creating safe sleep sites on a limited scale. I am very much against the idea of building more and more and more of them, but without the added backstop of an equal effort to end the idea of unsanctioned camping. That's the policy piece that's missing for me. And can you have 38 seconds here. Can you guys tell me, just with the 2 sites approved and the 3 on the table, how much will the city spend in one-time development of those sites, and then separately any ongoing expenditures for the 5?
I don't have all of those numbers off the top of my head, but I just want to remind that we have $3.5 million that we received in state ARPA funding that is being used for the infrastructure, lease costs, and things like that. Operational costs will be funded hopefully with other ARPA dollars that we're hoping to use for that purpose. But and I can get you the number. I don't know. Matt shared what the annual operating costs will be for the 2nd and Garfield site, and I can get you guys more specific information for the others, kind of as we're thinking about the bigger rollout.
It's an important part of the decision for me today too, with regard to what are the ongoing costs for what we've created, and how long do the ARPA dollars last before we're funding it with general fund? And you don't have those numbers today?
I can get them. I will get them before the end of this call so that you can make an informed decision. I think Brooke has some information about that. The other thing I want to say is that you might recall that ordinance that council passed, it sunsets May 2023. So the agreements that we're making are in the 18-month to 2-year frame time. So that's the money that we're looking at. So it's not, there'll be bigger decisions I think that council will have to make in the future as we think about analyzing the effectiveness of these sites. So
with 5 seconds, I'll say, yes, I think those are important considerations. We created temporary camping sites, several in the past few years, that don't show any signs of going away anytime soon. So thank you, though.
Thank you. Claire, and then Greg.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Christy, Matt, and everyone who's working on these sites. I'm very excited that we've got an opening for our first site. And I guess I would say the fact that we have a full list of people who want to move in there actually points to the fact that if we open them, people will want to move in there. Not everyone, but obviously a significant number of people. And these sites are not a solution to our homelessness crisis, but they are a strategy to create legal, safer places for people that connects them to case management and helps them move out of homelessness. Leaving people to fend for themselves on our streets, sidewalks, or in the bushes is not going to provide for that same kind of opportunity and improvement, both in the quality of life for our housed community members and those who are experiencing homelessness. I do have a couple of questions and requests of staff. So I would like to ask that counselors start getting documentation on the business and residential outreach that is done in their ward as we consider a site or when we decide to move forward with one. I have had more than one time where staff had said, oh, we've done outreach to nearby neighbors, but those same nearby neighbors tell me that they were never contacted. So I don't know if that's they got missed or someone came by and left a flyer but didn't talk to them. But I would like us to receive some kind of documentation on how that's being handled, who's being spoken with, so that I can feel confident that that work is being done. And I do have an email from the owner of the Big Y Laundromat there on Highway 99 that I will forward to you all, who definitely needs some outreach, who just learned about the site on Garfield and is concerned about it. And then what is the plan to ensure that folks who haven't been approved to come into one of these sites aren't setting up camp near the entrance or on the street in front of it? This is something we have a policy against for our rest stops, and I know we have some campers over near our Skinner Butte rest stop, and we need to have a plan to make sure that we're not letting folks gather outside of these places. And then to Mike's point, we can't compel people to go to these sites. That's not a authority we have, but we can compel them within the requirements of posting, that the feds and the state have put on us to leave our parks. And I've made it clear with staff that I expect us to begin enforcement of folks in Washington Jefferson as soon as we are able to provide them with an alternative place that they can go safely. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg, and then Randy.
Thanks, Mayor. I have a couple of issues that I want to address. And Christy, you made a really great comment earlier about the time frame that we have with this. Is there a plan for us to transition from this particular setup into the plan that we have through the TAC plan? How do we do that? When do we begin that? Because 2023 will be here, very, very soon. And there's going to be issues if we're still in the same position about how we fund and support what we're doing now beyond 2023. The other thing that I'm really concerned about is what relationships have we established with the school districts, particularly around kids who are having difficulties being able to do their homework, getting to school. They may not have an iPad or another device to do their homework on. I know my daughter does her homework on her iPad. So how are we handling that? And are we having those discussions with the school districts, both 4J and Bethel?
Councilor Evans, I really appreciate that second question around how we're supporting youth through this process. I think you bring up a really good point. One of the things that we're going to have, I think Matt mentioned at the second and Garfield site, is that there'll be Wi-Fi access. And so I think we could take a deeper dive in connecting directly with our partners at the school districts and make sure that any kids that are in these sites have what they need, but also as we think about how we support the unhoused throughout the community. So I'm flagging that as something I'll follow up on with the team to make sure that we spend more time giving that some thought. We are already beginning to think about I'm in conversations every week around the TAC implementation, and also Matt and I sit on the homeless implementation pipeline team. We're spending a lot of time thinking about what are the strategies to help people transition to the other services. You might recall that we heard that the 75-bed low barrier shelter will be implemented and launched next July. That could be a place for some folks that might need some assistance as well. There'll be some criteria about who goes in there based upon what the county, kind of those with the highest need. So we're working through that. And my hope is that we'll be able to actually come back to you and talk about some of the phase 2 next evolution of these sites as we move forward. So we stay in close contact and you stay engaged and have input into where we go.
Do we know where that 75 bed site is going to be? Because originally it was going to be on the corner of Roosevelt 99, and somebody bought the property out from under us, and then we have to look for a different place, different location.
Yeah, it's on River Avenue, and right now they're in the process of doing the plans for the building upgrades that need to happen to support that site. They're hoping that maybe they can even accommodate a few more than anticipated.
Talking about the old VA building?
I think it was a post office, if I recall correctly. Well, maybe no, post office was across the street.
Yeah,
I grew up in that neighborhood. You would think you know these things. So yeah, okay. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Randy, and then Alan.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Christy, Matt, and everybody who worked on this presentation. And I also want to give a special appreciation to Ed Russo for the work he's been doing with our business community, and Pastor Gabe, who's been, I shadowed him for a full day, and he's just phenomenal on his outreach and contact with our unhoused community. These sites can't be opened fast enough, in my opinion, and I will be supporting this motion today. I do agree with Councillor Clark that we need to know what the hard bottom line is going to be. I believe that part of our challenge with some of the inflow is a reputation for no rules, which is not the case here. And we need to make sure that as long as we have adequate space, that we are enforcing the camping, not only in our parks, and I agree with Councilor Syret on that, but also our public open spaces and our right-of-ways and our streets. They aren't safe places for our unhoused community. They impact residents and businesses, which affects jobs. Our streets are not designed for this purpose. We have, raw sewage being dumped in them, garbage, although it's improved some in West Eugene, and I appreciate those efforts. We need to figure out how we're going to address the end game of this once we do have adequate spaces out there. And I would really like to see a work session just on that issue alone of how are we going to do this? What is the plan? I know it's complicated. I know it takes resources. But as we enter this conversation with CSI dollar allocations and everything else, we need to be taking all this into account. So I very much look forward of how we're going to address that. What is our plan for restoring order to our community? And I believe community members on all sides of this issue are hungry for some kind of a plan and a course of action that we are going to take as a city. So, anyway, I do appreciate the updates. I will say I too would like to know what businesses, what neighborhoods are connected with by city staff. And then the last thing I want to say, I really don't have any questions today, but other than enforcement. But my last thing I want to say as well, it's not just our business community that's come together in West Eugene and working on this. It's a number of businesses in our communities. And I will also add the Churchill area neighbors who have taken it upon themselves to repeatedly clean up garbage, needles, and trash that's strewn along our bike paths. And without them, I'm not sure we would be as clean as we are. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, and then Matt.
Yes, thank you to all the folks that have been working on this. This is really tough work but extremely important. And you're under the pressure of everybody saying it's not enough, not fast enough, but keep going. We need more of these, and we need to keep them going. I agree it's a short-term strategy, but we need to keep going in this regard. At least in these sites, they are organized, they're planned, they're built, and they're supervised. And so they're very different animals from the unorganized camps, especially. So that's why we're doing it. Second, I agree with what Mike said that part of the reason I've been supporting these things moving forward is to alleviate the mess that's at 13th and Jefferson Washington Park. And if we're not getting a lot of people go from there to these new sites, my thought was that would be the highest priority. So I'd like to make sure that getting those people moved out of those sites so we can shut them down and reclaim the park, for instance, is a high priority for sites that we do. But I also understand the nature of the reason behind the Jefferson Washington Park was COVID, and we're still under COVID, and we still have the CDC guidelines. I'm wondering if anybody has any insight into that from staff about where we are in the status of that, and the ability to take a different tack once those guidelines get lifted that we've been following.
So Councilor Zelenka, we continue to check in with Lane County Public Health and monitor OHA and CDC guidelines, and nothing has changed as far as their recommendations around people that are unhoused and trying to allow them to shelter where they are. Of course, there's other public health challenges that come into place where we need to act sometimes to tell folks you can't stay here if there are other circumstances that compel that. As Councilor Syrett said about kind of intention around how we manage 13th and Washington Jefferson Park, she is correct that the intention would be is as people have the opportunity to move into these sites that we are kind of doing phased drawdowns in those parks. That it's unlikely that we would have the capacity to maybe do all of that at once. Maybe that's true, but it's probably more likely that we would do phased drawdowns as we're offering places to people.
Good. And the obvious answer to the COVID guidelines and the COVID being lifted is everybody get vaccinated, and then the pandemic ends. But one more question about 410 Garfield. I noticed there's a big building there, existing structure. Is the plan to have the tents be in the structure and the vehicles be in the parking lot? Is that the plan?
Yeah, so we've been working with the fire marshal's office to really understand, what we can do as far as placing tents or other structures within the kind of warehouse area. And our understanding, and we're still dialing it in, is that we could have, I think we said up to 90 tents in that warehouse, which will add some additional shelter from weather conditions, warmer environment. There's a 1,800 square foot office building that goes with it that would allow St. Vincent de Paul to have some offices and places where case managers and other service providers could come in and meet people. And as you said, we could use some of the outside space for vehicles or Conestoga huts or pallet shelters or something like that.
Yeah, I guess as long as people aren't cooking or doing things inside, that would be safe. Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, I think the motions are appropriate. I think we need to keep going on this tact. And I know it's a temporary strategy. It's too little, but we still need to move in this direction. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt, and then Emily.
Thanks, Mayor. Thinking along the same lines as Councilor Zelenka, I wonder if I can get a quick vaccination requirement update for these sites, please.
Good question. So it's my understanding that we can require some things to be done at those sites for people participating. And so I'm exploring that right now with the staff team and working with the provider.
Okay. It's not going to hold me up from supporting the motions, but I would be strongly in favor of a full vaccination and masking requirement from staff and from folks who are utilizing the shelter. I wonder if, considering through sponsors, the local welders, painters, and roofers are putting folks most in need to work, I wonder if there's an opportunity from our for-profit sector to maybe provide some sponsorship of these sites and provide some sweat equity or some assistance. So it's a full collaborative municipal for-profit and nonprofit partnership. Moreover, Councilor Groves mentioned the adequate space that got me thinking about the need for adequate staffing, adequate training, and adequate safety protocol. When Councilor Groves and I floated the Willamette River with Willamette Riverkeeper, and we met with park ambassadors, I was a bit taken back to learn that some of our park ambassadors don't even carry radios. They're often, they'll call cahoots and be in the same order that any one of us from the community would be if we called cahoots. I wonder if there's an intersection between our previous presentation and this one to provide some funding for radio equipment or training. Could you comment on the security personnel, either at Wash Jeff or at the proposed sites, what level of training, what level of cultural competency, what level of de-escalation training and resources will that team have? Will that team be an EPD park team as is at Wash Jeff? Will it be park ambassadors? What is the staffing level and training thereof look like?
Councilor Keating, maybe I can speak briefly to our parks employees that are involved in work like Washington Jefferson, the 13th, or as you said, along the river. We've actually been talking with EPD, and I'd have to go back and check with my staff to see if we've implemented it, but about the potential to have direct radio access, at least to the EPD parks officers. So we have 2 officers that are assigned to parks that support our staff. They're in very close contact. I'm not sure at this time whether or not that's radio contact. And then as far as the staffing at the safe sleep sites, and I will say they have a number of trainings that they do take around cultural competence and how de-escalation training and other trainings to help them in that work. Reagan Watches is on this call as well. I'm wondering if she might be able to talk to staffing at safe sleep sites.
Sure. Hi, I'm Reagan Watches. I work in the city manager's office as a policy analyst. So yeah, the social service providers that will be operating these sites, they have a training curriculum that they go through for mainly related to evidence-based practices for serving people experiencing homelessness. So that includes trauma, things like trauma-informed care, housing first, crisis de-escalation, cultural competency, motivational interviewing, CPR and first aid, things like that.
Okay, thank you. And if I could get a quick update. Several weeks ago, I inquired about potable water and electrification at these sites, specifically to provide plugins, not just for phones so folks can get connected to vital services, but for medical reasons. There may be folks who of our most vulnerable populations that need to be connected to machines to help them breathe. CPAP machines come to mind. Can we get an update in regards to electrification and potable water hookups at these sites, please?
The ordinance that you passed required those be conditions, and so those are going into the sites that we're utilizing.
Great. That's all I need to hear. Thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
Okay, thank you, Emily, and then we'll go through some second rounds.
Thank you. Fortunately, I'm not having a really great brain day, so I'm not going to be quite as exuberant as I want to be, but this is fantastic stuff. It isn't enough, and we're all really tired, but I do think that we just need to take a little pause here and say, wow, 5 sites. You know, I know it's almost October and we asked months ago, but it takes a really long time, and I think it's important that we all say thank you to each other and ourselves, that it's been really hard and we're not there and we may never be there, but we've made a really good stride. And just stop at the rest stop for a minute, you know, like when you're driving on the highway and say, wow, we're doing great. And I want us to keep doing great and be even better. But I have some small questions. The building, you know, it's just this amorphous building I'm trying to picture filled up with tents. I kind of have a picture of a parking garage, and I'm sure that's not right. But where will they cook in that building? You know, this is going to be like an enclosed campground. So, you know, we've got ventilation and COVID, and people are going to need to eat. So I haven't had lunch yet, and that's a really big concern is how are people going to feed themselves? The outreach to the neighborhoods, it's possibly the biggest thing, the most important thing. Looking way back to my desperate efforts to have a downtown place to sleep on the old City Hall lot and how that blew up. So please, let's make sure we do it. If need be, I'll go out in my ward if you want me to come talk to people. I think that it's critical we're all on board with what we do so that we don't end up having infighting. We could use that energy for taking care of each other even better. I'm wondering why, having read the RG, when I can get them to bring it to me, which is seldom, that the sites that we have aren't filled. There's Boise lurking around, and we can't arrest people if there aren't sites to fill, but for them to sleep. But there are places for people to sleep that aren't being used, and we have people camping all over the place. So kind of two questions. I'm going to run out of time. My brain isn't keeping up today. But how are we going to deal with keeping people from moving back into the camps that we're moving people out of? When we're doing great, I'm out of time, but how is this going to work with people on the ground and where they're sleeping in our empty spots and our full spots? And thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilor Semple. I'll let Reagan speak to the establishment of how people are going to be able to have food services on the site that we're planning for at 410. Your comments about the outreach to the neighborhood are critical, and we'll definitely get the information that Councilor Syrette was requesting and make sure that council has more comprehensive information, because we know that that's really, really critical. Sites not filled up. I'm not exactly sure what sites you're referring to. We do know that on a day-to-day basis that Dusk to Dawn has somewhere between 2 to 5 spaces available. Our staff know that. They've been, asking people, if they want to transition over to those sites. So there's that close collaboration. And Reagan might be able to provide updates on other shelter capacity that's available.
Sure. So to your first question, Councilor Semple, we still have a number of details to work out related to the 410 site once it's approved, or if it is approved today. And we're working with St. Vincent de Paul to see particularly about, food and cooking and how they may be able to partner, with some of the other programs and services they have in their organization. And at 310 Garfield, that was something we really had to work through as well. And people will be allowed to cook on site. 410 is a little different because of the setup. So we're going to have to work through those details. And then related to the underutilization of some programs, I think, that's twofold. I think for programs like Dusk to Dawn, our larger shelters, they do stay pretty full. They might, as Christy mentioned, have 2 to 5 beds available a night. They see more turnover than some of our other programs. And then some of our other alternative shelter programs, what I would say is we're continuing to work with providers and get a better understanding of shelter utilization and capacity across our system and some of the challenges. But I think what I would say is there's kind of twofold reason to that. And part of it is program staffing and workforce in this area. We have challenges in our provider capacity and finding qualified people to staff these programs. And then I think the other piece of that is what we're hearing from our rest stop providers is that people who are coming to these programs have been higher needs than some of the folks they have served previously. They're seeing people with higher needs try to access that, which requires more one-on-one and focused attention on those sites. So that's what I would say about shelter utilization, but there is work. I know the PHB Shelter Stakeholder Committee is continuing to dive into this question as well.
So our biggest problem is people, that we need more people to take care of people in the empty beds.
Okay, I want to give everyone a little time check. It's 1:34. We have 3 important motions to vote on. I'm looking at both Claire and Mike and knowing that you have a second round of comments. Do you need to make those comments before we quickly? All right, everyone's okay with an extended meeting for another few minutes to allow that? Okay, go ahead, take it away, Claire.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to offer that for the school districts, they are required by federal law to have a homeless liaison. They're called the McKinney-Vento coordinator. And so that would be the person that the city would want to coordinate with if we had homeless youth at any of these locations. And then the thing that Councilor Semple was referring to, Christy, is the RG articles cited statistics on how many beds were available and how many of them were occupied during whatever time frame they looked at. They probably pulled that data from the county's dashboard, and those are county managed, not county managed sites, but sites that the county is funding. So that wouldn't include the city funded Dusk Till Dawn or rest stop sites. And I think what Reagan said is absolutely correct. Our service providers are understaffed, just like our motels and restaurants and, you know, every other business in town. And so they may just not be able to use their full capacity right now. Thanks.
Mike, one last quick comment.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate it. I still think the point is relevant that we have underutilized space and we have a very, very large number of people who are camping publicly in both unsupervised and unsanctioned areas. And that's the disconnect that the general public doesn't understand. And that's the piece that leads me to say our policy is incomplete in the way we're approaching this. And I very much appreciate both Emily's questions and Councilor Grove's comments too. And so I'd like to ask staff to please prepare a work session poll for the opportunity to have the discussion like I brought up and like Randy said earlier about what's our next piece. And to illustrate it just a little bit further, if Matt and or Christy could tell me what are the screening criteria? In other words, for what behaviors or for what conditions would someone not be allowed to become a part of any of these new camps?
Counselor, we have Reagan on the phone, who's probably best positioned to answer that. She works with all those programs closely.
So we're working to set these safe sleep sites up to be as low barrier as possible. So they're really focused on behavior that would create a safety hazard to, you know, create an unsafe environment.
Can you be more specific about the criteria? For what thing would someone say, no, I'm sorry, you can't be here?
It's minimal. I mean, it's St. Vincent de Paul, they do an intake and people have to provide, you know, their name and information to get on the list, or to be able to gain entry. And then really, you know, it's more if they have 24/7 monitoring. So if, you know, someone is not complying with the rules, then they can be exited.
That's what I'm asking about the rules. Is drug use okay in those camps?
No, there's
what else is not okay?
So we have, there's no weapons, no illegal drugs, no illegal activity, no loud music or disruptive noise, no overnight visitors, no physical violence, threatening behavior, things like that.
And those are good policies, I think. Do those apply to either of the camps at Washington Jefferson or to 13th and Chambers that are unsanctioned camps at this time? Do people have to behave in the same way there? Christy or Matt?
Councilor Clark, we have a list of criteria that we have for monitoring and assessing campsites at those parks. That does include some overlap. I think what's different here is you have a much higher level of staff support and monitoring at safe sleep sites and the ability to have service provider support to come in to help people with mental health challenges or addiction issues or something they might be experiencing.
But we may add vaccination status to that as well, if Matt has his way here, I think. The point is, for those who say, no, I don't want to, or I can't, or I, you know, we say, or the service provider says, don't qualify to be here. That's our missing piece right now. And I hope if enough counselors support it, we can have a good work session to talk about what do we do to respond for that. Thank you.
Christy, it looks like you had one more thing you wanted to say.
I do. I want to respond to Councilor Clark's question about the funding. And so on April 13th, we gave you, there was a chart that you guys we shared with you about what we thought the costs would be. And the costs are roughly $4 million annually for all 500, assuming all of those programs are implemented. And so, we're kind of bringing them up as we have sites ready to roll. So right now that number is less than that amount, but that was the amount that we provided to you. And it's still consistent with what we're seeing.
Thank you very much. And only until it sunsets in 23 and we have to pay for it?
After that, yeah, we would be coming back in advance of that. And then, yeah, yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Obviously, we could talk about this for a long time. We do have 3 motions. I just want to say one thing. I just want to sort of, in the stepping back and looking at the big picture, that our goal all along has been to try to provide housing and shelter for people who want and need it. And our police chief has said all along, just give me a place to send people to, so then I can take care of things and I have some clarity on the streets. And that's the direction we're going. So I do think that follow up on the CSI, that follow up with, as we create clarity with these safe sleeping sites and all of the other work we're doing, then we create clarity also on the public safety side about what the need is and what the response could be. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer to put the first motion on the table.
Thanks, Mayor. I move to approve 2243 Roosevelt Square One Villages for use as a safe sleep site.
Second.
All in favor, please raise your hands. 1, 2, oops, here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Greg, you have 7. Okay, and opposed? 1. Thank you. That passes. On to the next one.
I move to approve Danny Street, Every One Village, as a safe sleep site.
Second.
All in favor, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Opposed? 1. Thank you. And the final one?
I move to approve 410 Garfield for use as both a safe tent and safe parking site, and based on the large size of the property, authorize the co-location of multiple groups at this site.
Second.
All in favor, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Opposed? 1. Thank you all. A great presentation, great conversation. Thanks for the excellent work, and we are adjourned.